On Midtown Manhattan nights, when the streets have thinned out and the last light in office towers turns into a dull aquarium glow, the blocks around Grand Central Terminal hold a different kind of quiet. The building is still there, heavy and exact, its stone set to outlast whatever the city calls the present. Above ground, it is a place of schedules and announcements, of polished brass and the steady logic of arrivals. But below it, below Park Avenue, below the split-level geometry of tracks, platforms, and utility corridors, New York keeps another register. Spaces built for work that no longer exist. Passages sealed not because they are dangerous in a dramatic way, but because they are inconvenient to remember. There is a storage yard beneath the Waldorf Astoria, an underground fan of tracks known as Lex Yard. Among them is a siding labeled Track 61, running beside a private platform that was never meant to be a station in the usual sense. It was built as part of the Grand Central Terminal project in the 1910s, at a time when the New York Central Railroad was moving an entire terminal and yard below street level, creating 2 track levels and freeing the surface for buildings that would sit on air rights like a second city. The platform by Track 61 has a functional origin that is not glamorous. It was originally tied to the terminal's power and heating plant operations, moving ash and servicing the machinery that kept steam and electricity flowing. When the 50th Street power plant was demolished to make way for what became the Waldorf Astoria building in 1931, the yard beneath remained, a leftover anatomy of tracks, gratings in sidewalks, and wide loading platforms that continued to exist because removing them would have meant tearing up the city's foundations. What makes Track 61 persist in public imagination is not its engineering, but its closeness to power. Official accounts describe its occasional use for discreet arrivals. General John J. Pershing in 1938, Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1944, Douglas MacArthur in 1951. The events appear as dry, isolated points in newspapers and terminal histories, names passing through a space that was otherwise industrial. The mythology tends to soften the place, as though secrecy itself were the story, but the physical reality of it is harsher. Track 61 sits in a 12-track storage yard under a hotel with no daylight and no public reason to exist. The platform between Track 61 and Track 63 is wide enough to be useful, but not meant to be welcoming. It is a working edge: concrete, columns, old paint, metal doors that do not announce where they go. On some streets above, sidewalk gratings still offer quick glimpses of train roofs and the suggestion of motion beneath your feet. If you ride a Metro North train out of Grand Central and look right at the correct moment, you can sometimes see a fragment of that backwater yard, a line of track disappearing into a place that isn't part of passenger life. It is not staged for discovery. It passes in a second, like a gap in a fence. The title that has attached itself to this place, Trains Sealed Alive, is not a phrase you will find in official terminal histories. It is the kind of wording that grows when infrastructure becomes story, when a set of doors becomes a boundary, when a storage yard becomes a sealed chamber, when the city's habit of forgetting turns mechanical. What can be verified is that Track 61 has been treated, at different times, as something to conceal. It has been blocked off from public access, it has carried rumors, it has held rail cars for decades. A baggage car, MNCW002, sat on nearby Track 63 for 20 to 30 years, its presence feeding a long-running claim that it was Roosevelt's personal car. That claim was incorrect, and the car was eventually moved to a museum in 2019. The important detail is not the correction. It is the fact that a rail car could sit underground for decades, unvisited except by those who already had keys. In the mid-20th century, the space was used for events that now read like mistakes in judgment. A locomotive exhibition in 1946, a fashion show lunch staged in a diner car in 1948, a charity benefit dinner in 1955, an underground party linked to Andy Warhol in 1965. These were not legends, they were attempts to repurpose a working void into a venue. People brought down into a siding, fed and photographed, then returned to the surface. The gesture itself is disturbing in its calmness, the idea that you can borrow a space built for ash and power and call it a night out, as if concrete and steel have no memory. What happened to Track 61 after the glamour drained away is less documented, and that absence is part of the unease. The Columbia University archived account notes that by 1978, the platform was known as one of the many places in Grand Central where squatters lived. This is not a sensational claim, it is a practical one. In the 1970s, New York had spaces where people fell through the system, and the terminal's recesses provided shelter. A station can be both a monument and a hiding place. The same architecture that moves crowds can also create pockets where no one looks. Below ground, the city's order depends on locked doors and staff habits. Who checks what, how often, whether a padlock is replaced after a cut. Track 61's platform had stairways and freight elevator access to the street, an entrance on 49th Street behind a brass-marked door, and another exit on the 50th Street side. It was built for freight and retrofitted for discretion, meaning it was never designed with the assumptions of a public station. It did not need to guide lost people back to safety, because it was not supposed to have lost people. And this is where the documentary record begins to feel like a corridor with missing lights. The official story is that Track 61 is a storage track, part of a yard, occasionally used, mostly dormant. It is described as not really an abandoned station, but close enough to one to be mentioned as such. The problem with spaces like this is not what they were designed for, it is what they become when the design assumptions expire. A storage yard below a hotel is a place where rolling stock can be held out of sight. It is also a place where something can be left, not metaphorically, physically left. A rail car moved onto a siding and forgotten by anyone who does not need to know what is there. A maintenance consist pushed past a ladder track and parked in the triangle outside the main flow. A door shut and relabeled as something else. The phrase "sealed alive" suggests a moment when the ordinary logic of railroading, movement, schedules, clearances, failed in a small, silent way. It suggests that the sealing was not theatrical. A gate rolled, a lock clicked, a signalman assumed a clearance that never came. In the underground spaces of Grand Central, silence is not empty. It is pressurized by distance, by concrete, by the knowledge that the surface world cannot hear you. To understand why that implication holds, you have to accept something the station's history makes plain. The underground here is not one basement. It is an entire buried district. In another part of the terminal complex, deep below, there is M42, a sub-basement electrical facility built into bedrock, an industrial chamber that has been described as 10 to 13 stories down, roughly 105 to 109 feet below ground, accessed by a single elevator and staircase. It exists to keep the third rail alive, to convert power and push it into the city's circulatory system. M42's presence matters because it sets the scale of what lies below. Grand Central's basements span 48 acres. Rooms were carved to house boilers, coal bunkers, rotary converters, cranes. Equipment weighing hundreds of tons was moved through hatches and lowered into place while train service continued, because the city could not stop for engineering. In spaces built like that, the boundary between in use and forgotten is thin. It is often the difference between a checklist line and an omitted note. Track 61 is not as deep as M42, but it belongs to the same logic. A buried system built to run without pause, modified over decades, patched around new construction, and managed by institutional memory as much as by maps. CNN's account of touring these spaces emphasizes unmarked doors and corridors that don't exist on any plans, a phrase that is both boast and warning. When a place doesn't exist on any plans, it can still exist in steel, and steel does not care whether it is remembered. The dark story of Track 61 begins with that contradiction. A track that was never meant for passengers, later associated with presidents and private arrivals, then treated as a rumor, then treated as a liability, then treated as nothing at all. It is a place where a train can stop and not be seen, where a door can close and not be checked, where a sealed space can remain sealed because nobody has a reason to open it. There is no need to invent ghosts in a tunnel like this. The mechanical world is sufficient. The horror, if it comes from procedure. What happens when procedure becomes assumption and assumption becomes silence? In Part 2, the story moves into the technical body of Track 61, its geometry, its access points, the flaws that come with retrofits, and the early warnings that appear, quietly, in how the terminal was built to hide its own machinery. The most important thing to understand about Track 61 is that it is not a single tunnel with a clear beginning and end. It is part of a yard, Lex Yard, where tracks split, stub, and rejoin in patterns designed for storage, turning movements, and keeping trains out of the way. It sits northeast of Grand Central Terminal, beneath streets and buildings that were never meant to advertise that there were rails under them. The Waldorf Astoria was built directly above this infrastructure on a long lease of air rights, a real estate arrangement that only makes sense in a city willing to stack ownership vertically. There is a phrase used in older descriptions of Grand Central's redevelopment. The terminal and yard were relocated below street grade in a bold move, occupying more property than the old depot had. 2 track levels were created. Above them, the surface was freed for buildings. The result was an engineered compromise, trains running in a constructed underground landscape with streets and towers overhead, and utilities threaded through everything. A compromise like that is stable only as long as its documentation stays intact. But in Grand Central's underground, documentation has always had gaps. M42, the deep electrical subbasement, is explicitly described as having a precise location not listed on any blueprints, and in some retellings it becomes a point of civic pride, a hidden room, a secret machine. In practice, the same hiddenness that protects infrastructure can also erode oversight. Track 61's platform was never built for passengers, and that detail shapes everything about its risk. Passenger platforms assume the presence of the public, lighting, signage, redundant exits, emergency protocols that treat human confusion as expected. A freight platform assumes something else: controlled access, trained staff, predictable movements. The Waldorf platform had stairways and freight elevator access to street level on 49th Street and another stair exit on the 50th Street side. It was built from necessity, not hospitality. When the Waldorf was planned, the New York Times announced in September 1929 that the new hotel would have a private railway siding underneath, where guests with private railroad cars could be routed directly to the hotel instead of Penn Station or Grand Central Terminal. It reads like a luxury feature, but it is also a description of a logistical shortcut, a rail car shunted into the storage yard, aligned with a platform, and connected to the street by freight infrastructure. The first documented major use that confirms the system's purpose came in April 1938, when General John J. Pershing arrived by special rail car and was moved through a freight elevator. Contemporary reporting describes elaborate precautions, detectives, camera flashes, and a freight elevator entrance into the hotel. Even in this early moment, it is clear the system was not a seamless private passage rising straight into suites. It was a controlled, guarded transfer through a service-grade threshold. That distinction matters because it exposes a design weakness, a private siding and platform that depends on multiple handoffs: rail crews, hotel security, elevator mechanics, street-level coordination. The more handoffs, the more likely it is that a gap forms where no single person holds the full responsibility for what is happening below ground. In a public terminal, that gap is narrowed by constant presence. In a private siding, the gap can widen quietly. Grand Central's underground is also defined by its ladders, track connections that move trains between the two levels and into the main station platform tracks. The Columbia diagram description places the Waldorf platform outside the main flow, in a triangular backwater near 50th Street and Lexington Avenue, separated from station platforms by ladder tracks. It is precisely the kind of geometry that makes a siding feel like it is not part of the system, even though it is physically connected to it. A place like that accumulates overlooked details. One is the missing track numbers that recur around Grand Central. There is no track 62 in this section. There is also no track 12 in the station's platform numbering. These are not ominous in themselves. They are artifacts of expansion, renumbering, and operational pragmatism. But they create a subtle cognitive friction, gaps in the map, places where the numbering does not reassure you that the system is complete. Another overlooked detail is the elevator itself. It was not part of the original 1912 diagrams. It appears later in the space of a former pipe shaft. That means the vertical access was a retrofit, installed after the powerhouse closed, and likely aligned with the construction of the Waldorf Astoria. Retrofits are not failures, they are how cities survive. But every retrofit carries a legacy: a shaft repurposed, a door cut into a wall, a stairwell added without redesigning the whole environment. In a controlled industrial setting, retrofits are tracked and tested. In a layered, privately shared setting, railroad below, hotel above, responsibility blurs. The track is owned by the railroad, the space above is owned or controlled by the hotel, access points sit on city streets. CNN's description of touring Track 61 and M42 emphasizes how access depends on unmarked doors, resourcefulness, and being the right kind of person. Even in modern media, the narrative is that permission is personal, not procedural. That is not how safety systems are supposed to feel. Warnings, when they appear, tend to be mundane. They appear in anecdotes about who was allowed where and what was considered suspicious. In M42's case, stories circulated about armed guards instructed to shoot on sight anyone entering with a bucket of sand during World War II, based on fears that sand could sabotage the rotary converters by vitrifying into glass-like mass. The historic truth behind specific targeting is debated, but the operational reality is documented. The room was critical, heavily protected, and designed to be shut down by a button. Even stripped of drama, it tells you something. Grand Central's underground contains points where a small action can have enormous consequences. Track 61's vulnerability is smaller, but more intimate. It is vulnerable not to sabotage at national scale, but to the ordinary failures of coordination in a place where the public does not go. Lighting can be turned off and left off. A gate can be locked and left locked. A work train can be staged and then forgotten in a schedule change. In this yard, trains are not simply trains. They are assets that can be stored. The same quality that makes Track 61 useful, its ability to hold rolling stock out of the way, also makes it capable of hiding an error. The mythology around Roosevelt sharpened that hiding into a single image: a limousine rolling off an armored rail car, into a freight elevator, and up into the hotel. It is a story that was repeated for years by guides and media, and then disputed by researchers who pointed out the rail car associated with the story was actually baggage car MNCW 0002 and not Roosevelt's, and that the car in elevator tale would have required implausible geometry. The correction is important, but so is what it reveals. For decades, the public accepted that a train could carry a car into a hidden station beneath a hotel. They accepted it because the infrastructure makes the idea believable. The city has conditioned people to accept that there are layers below them they will never see, and that those layers contain doors that open only for certain names. In 1978, there were even plans to convert Track 61 into a platform for Amtrak trains, another attempt to repurpose buried infrastructure. It never happened. Plans that never happen are not neutral. They leave behind partial assessments, internal memos, and conversations that do not always reach the people who later inherit the space. That kind of institutional sediment is where patterns form. In the years when Track 61 was not serving dignitaries or staged events, it served as what it had always been, an edge space, a place to put things, a place to keep them. Accounts from Gothamist note that by 1978, the platform was known as one of the many places in Grand Central where squatters lived, and that access to Track 61 became a holy grail for urban explorers. These are not mutually exclusive. The same hiddenness that attracts exploration can also allow people to disappear from the city's surface life. The overlooked flaw is not a cracked wall or a failing beam. It is that Track 61 sits at the intersection of multiple kinds of secrecy: operational, commercial, and cultural. Operational secrecy says the yard is non-revenue, restricted, a working zone. Commercial secrecy says the hotel above is luxury, private, controlled. Cultural secrecy says New York is a city with hidden rooms beneath famous places, and that those rooms belong to whoever has access. When those three reinforce each other, oversight becomes less visible. It becomes an assumption that someone else has it. And then there are the technical realities that rarely appear in stories because they are too plain. Air, ventilation, heat, the smell of brake dust and oil in confined spaces. In M42, ventilating fans circulate air and exhaust it through a hotel smokestack. The city's hidden systems share air pathways with places where people sleep. Track 61, under the Waldorf, exists within that same logic of shared engineered atmosphere. A sealed door underground is not just a boundary, it is a decision about air. The phrase "sealed alive" begins to become less metaphorical when you consider what it would mean for a train to be left in a siding like this, with its doors closed, its power cut, and the yard secured. It does not require malice, it requires timing. It requires a shift change, a miscommunication, a lock replaced after trespass concerns, a note filed under the wrong job number. It requires, above all, that the place is not part of anyone's daily route. What follows in Part 3 is the period where Track 61's hiddenness intersects with the city's most vulnerable years, when infrastructure aged, staffing thinned, and the underground became a place where the official and unofficial used the same corridors. The incidents that emerge are not a single catastrophic event, they are a cluster. Small failures, disturbing accounts, and one darker period when the idea of something being sealed below stops feeling like rumor and starts feeling like the kind of mistake a city can make without noticing. By the time the city reached the late 1960s and 1970s, Grand Central Terminal was still monumental above ground, but below ground its scale began to work against it. The basements were not designed as a single coherent underworld, they were built as layers of purpose: boilers, coal handling, electrical conversion, storage yards, trucking subways for package service, then altered as needs changed. The Columbia account describes how entire buildings along 49th and 50th Streets once served the railroad: a powerhouse, an electrical building, an Adams Express facility, a railroad YMCA. Many of these were demolished or repurposed when the Waldorf Astoria rose above the yard and when the railroad began purchasing steam and power externally. The surface narrative of Track 61 remained clean: an occasional discreet arrival, a rare exhibition, a rumor about presidents. The underground narrative grew less clean, in part because the city itself grew less clean, and in part because a storage yard under a hotel is exactly the kind of place where governance becomes indistinct. There are records of Track 61 being used for a documentary film shoot in 1961 and for the Andy Warhol event in 1965, an underground party staged 2 stories below the Waldorf Astoria, catered by the hotel, described even at the time as a dingy hole, despite the guest list. The important detail is not celebrity, it is that by the 1960s, the space was already being treated as an aesthetic, a controlled descent into industrial gloom, then a controlled ascent back to marble and light. Controlled is the key word. Control implies someone is counting heads, someone is keeping the gates open long enough, someone is watching the stair exits, someone is sure the freight elevator is unlocked from the right side. That is how you use a space like this safely. You run it like a confined industrial site, not like a novelty. But the confined industrial site was not being run for the public anymore. It was being run for operations, storage, staging, maintenance, and those operations were increasingly shaped by budget, staffing, and the slow drift of institutional memory. Even the myths around Track 61 show how easily that memory could distort. The baggage car MNCW 0002 sat nearby for decades, generating a false narrative about Roosevelt and an armored limousine, and only much later was the error formally corrected and the car moved. If the public story could be wrong for decades, it is not difficult to imagine how internal stories could degrade too, especially in spaces rarely visited by anyone who did not have a specific task. The Columbia account notes, without emphasis, that by 1978, the Waldorf platform was one of the many places in Grand Central Terminal where squatters lived. That single line changes the moral geometry of the place. A private platform under a luxury hotel becomes, in the city's harder years, a shelter. The same stairways and freight access meant for discreet dignitaries become a route for those who have nowhere else to go. In most cities, squatting in an abandoned building is visible from the street. Broken windows, altered doorways, the social signal of neglect. In an underground platform, it is invisible. It can persist, not because people are looking away, but because people above do not even know there is something to look for. The pattern that emerges in accounts from employees and explorers, rarely formalized, usually shared as warnings, is that the most dangerous thing in these spaces is not structural collapse. It is the way the spaces can change hands without officially changing purpose. A storage yard becomes shelter. A locked door becomes a boundary between life and death. A work train becomes a room. The horror implied by sealed alive is not a single dramatic sealing. It is a series of small closures, a padlock after a trespass report, a gate shut because someone noticed footprints in dust, a work order that says secure access without listing what access means. In Grand Central, even the deepest critical rooms were known to have entrances that looked inconspicuous in public corridors. M42 was accessed by a single elevator and staircase described as inconspicuously placed, dug straight out of bedrock. This is how the terminal hides its organs, behind plain doors, behind corridors that commuters pass without seeing. Track 61 belongs to the same philosophy, and in the 1970s, that philosophy collided with a city that was no longer reliably staffed to check every hidden threshold. The darkest period associated with Track 61 is not documented in a single official report available to the public. It lives instead in a cluster of incidents that appear, briefly, and then vanish back into operational silence. Reports of people found in restricted areas, small electrical fires or smoke events in deep spaces that required difficult access, and the persistent need to block off certain corridors because the boundary between public and non-public had become porous. Grand Central has a history of deep subgrade emergencies that illustrate what confined rail spaces do to time. Fire engineering literature describes severe smoke and heat conditions in passenger cars beneath Grand Central, emphasizing how quickly a below-grade fire can make a train into a sealed container. Even without tying that event directly to Track 61, the principle is the same. Underground rail environments do not fail outward, they fail inward, filling with smoke, heat, and noise, while above ground, the city continues. That principle, failure inward, is what gives Track 61 its particular dread. A siding under a hotel is not a tunnel with through traffic, it is a dead-end logic. It is designed to hold. When people say trains were sealed alive, what they are pointing to is the possibility that a train, or a car, or a set of cars could be left on that track with someone inside while access points were secured. Not as punishment, not as a conspiracy, as an error. Consider the logistics. The Lex Yard is not public. Its access is constrained. Doors are unmarked. The platform is wide but not open. The stair exits are not part of daily passenger routes. The freight elevator is a piece of equipment that can be out of service, locked, or controlled by personnel who are not on the same radio channel as train crews. In such a system, a person's survival depends on two things: someone knowing they are there, and someone being able to reach them. In the years when squatters were reported to be living in parts of the terminal, both of those conditions are threatened. A person hiding in the yard may not want to be known. Staff may not want to acknowledge they have a problem they cannot easily solve. If a door is sealed to prevent entry, it also prevents exit. What makes this period particularly disturbing is that the city's own documentation habits encourage amnesia. When a space is not on blueprints, or when its purpose is non-revenue, incidents there do not naturally flow into public-facing narratives. M42's location being omitted from plans is described as a security measure and a curiosity, but it also demonstrates an institutional willingness to keep parts of the physical plant semi-deniable. In that environment, the absence of records does not reassure. It does the opposite. It suggests that what happened below could be treated as internal, resolved quietly, and filed away. There is another element that deepens the unease: the shared infrastructure between the railroad and the hotel. M42's ventilation exhaust is funneled through the Grand Hyatt's smokestack. This is not metaphor, it is a mechanical fact. The air pathways of buried utility spaces can be routed through the vertical systems of buildings above. Track 61 sits under the Waldorf Astoria. The yard's very existence is part of the hotel's foundation reality. When something goes wrong below, it is not only a rail problem, it is a building problem. It is a shared atmosphere problem. In the darkest accounts associated with Track 61, the details are always small. A locked brass door on 49th Street, marked as a fire exit, a stairwell that smells of oil and wet concrete, a platform where the sound of a train moving on the main lines is muffled, arriving as vibration through columns, a rail car left in the yard long enough for dust to form a skin over its paint, long enough for people to forget whether anyone last checked inside. Gothamist's report about visiting the platform notes that the space was long abandoned, that the train car and elevator were still present at the time, and that it was the kind of place likely never open to the public. It also notes, almost casually, that by 1978, it was known as one of the places squatters lived. That casualness is what makes the implication land. A place can be both famous and unmonitored. It can be both mythologized and neglected. It can be discussed as a presidential curiosity while simultaneously being a living hazard for people with no other shelter. If there was a moment when a train car was truly sealed with someone inside, it would likely not have looked like a story. It would have looked like routine. A crew shunting equipment onto a siding, a supervisor clearing the yard, a door locked after someone reported trespassers, a shift ending, then hours, then the kind of silence that only exists in a city when you are below it. Part 4 will not offer a neat resolution because infrastructure rarely does. It will follow the aftermath, how the space was increasingly sealed, how records became fragmented, how modern tours turned secrecy into spectacle, and how the psychological presence of the place persists, not as a ghost story, but as a lesson in how a system can hide its own mistakes. By the time Track 61 became widely known to the public, named in guidebooks, pointed out in online lists of secrets, filmed as a rare curiosity, the space itself had already entered its most stable phase, not active, not fully abandoned, but managed through restriction. The yard remained physically present beneath the Waldorf Astoria, part of the Metro North complex, but separated from daily passenger life by locked doors and habits of silence. Restriction is not the same as safety. It is simply an administrative boundary, a decision that the public should not be there and that only specific people should enter. For critical infrastructure, restriction is necessary, but in spaces that carry historical residue, spaces that have been repurposed, forgotten, rumored over, restriction can become a way to avoid confronting what the space has already been used for. The modern narrative emphasizes that Track 61 is no longer in use, that it was never intended for passenger service, and that you might catch a glimpse of it from a departing train if you know where to look. This is the sanitized version. It reduces the yard to an artifact. But buried infrastructure is never only artifact. It remains connected to systems that are alive. Power, ventilation, drainage, the movement of trains above and around it. M42 exists as a reminder that Grand Central's underground is still functional, still staffed, still dangerous in the way that large machines are dangerous. It provides electricity and converts power for third rails. It contains cranes and transformers and remnants of rotary converters. It is not a museum, even if it is occasionally toured. That coexistence, tourable secrecy and critical function, creates a psychological distortion. People who go down there are told to see wonder, hidden rooms, unmarked doors, history beneath their feet. CNN's account is explicit: no phones, no cameras, and quiet. It is framed as privilege, but the instruction is also the first principle of containment. Keep the story controlled, keep the images scarce, keep the space unaccounted for in the public mind. In the aftermath of the years when squatters were rumored to have lived in terminal backwaters, the city's response was not to illuminate these spaces, it was to harden them. The brass door on 49th Street, described as a Metro North fire exit, suggests a dual purpose. It is an emergency route, and it is a point of denial, marked as safety infrastructure while also serving as a barrier to curiosity. Hardening means more locks, more signage that says nothing, more reliance on staff memory. And staff memory is fragile. Track 61's most famous myth, Roosevelt's armored limousine and a rail car supposedly built to carry it, persisted for decades, in part because a rail car sat underground long enough to become a prop for the story. When that car was identified as baggage car MNCW-002 and removed to the Danbury Railway Museum in 2019, the story was corrected, but the deeper truth remained. A car can sit in that yard for 20 to 30 years and the city will accept it as normal. That acceptance is the lasting psychological presence of Track 61. Not the idea of precedence, but the idea of duration without oversight. The phrase, sealed alive, survives because it speaks to a realistic risk that does not require a dramatic event. A person in a railcar in Lex Yard is not protected by the logic of the public station. If a passenger collapses on a platform, there is flow. People, cameras, announcements, staff. If a worker is injured on a mainline track, there is procedure, radios, signal blocks, responses that must occur because the line must move. But in a dead-end storage siding, movement is optional. Silence is normal. In confined spaces, normal silence can mask abnormal silence. The fire engineering accounts of incidents beneath Grand Central, fires in passenger cars in deep areas, exist as stark reminders of how quickly underground rail spaces become sealed containers. Smoke does not disperse, it accumulates and migrates along the geometry of tunnels and corridors. Heat and toxic gases turn distance into time that people do not have. Even without tying any single fire directly to Track 61, the principle becomes part of the yard's implied threat. The danger is not that something monstrous lives there. The danger is that in the wrong conditions, the infrastructure itself becomes a lid. After the 2000s, Track 61's reputation shifted again. It became a symbol of contingency planning. Wikipedia notes that it was reportedly set as an escape option for President George W. Bush, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice during UN meetings in 2003, though the sourcing reflects how such claims often circulate through media rather than formal disclosure. The meaning is less about whether the plan was enacted and more about why the plan could exist at all, because the space is there, connected, and controllable. Control is an attractive quality for those who fear crowds, threats, exposure. It is also an attractive quality for those who fear scrutiny. In the years when tours were conducted, Track 61 and M42 were packaged as Secrets of New York, a set of hidden rooms beneath an iconic building. The effect is to turn restricted infrastructure into a story of civic mystique, but the deeper effect is to dull the reality of what secrecy does to responsibility. A secret space is, by definition, a space where fewer people notice what changes. And things do change. Doors are replaced, locks are upgraded, stairwells are remarked, ventilation systems are rerouted. The underground is always being adjusted, especially as projects like new rail terminals and renovations expand the subterranean footprint of Midtown. M42's own history includes massive relocation of 850 tons of equipment in 1929, while service continued, the kind of engineering that requires a tolerance for risk and a willingness to accept that the city cannot stop. That willingness remains part of New York's character. It is the same character that allows an underground yard under a luxury hotel to be treated as both historical curiosity and operational asset. It is the same character that allows a space to be not listed on any blueprints, and yet relied upon daily. So the aftermath of Track 61 is not closure, it is assimilation into the city's long habit of forgetting what it cannot monetize. People still try to locate it, to photograph it, to treat it as proof of hidden New York. The Gothamist visit notes that the space was unlikely ever to be open to the public unless someone lived there illegally. That line is not a joke. It is a blunt acknowledgement that public access is denied, but private access can occur anyway, through desperation, through obsession, through the gaps that always exist around locked doors. In that sense, Track 61 remains active as an idea, a test of how well the city seals what it wants to forget. The most disturbing part of this story is not what can be proven, it is what can be inferred from the shape of the infrastructure and the habits that surround it. We know the platform exists. We know it was built for industrial logistics and later adapted for discrete arrivals. We know it had stairways and freight elevator access to the street. We know that people with influence used it, that events were staged there, that plans were proposed and abandoned, that squatters were believed to have lived in terminal backwaters, that a rail car sat underground for decades, and that access is still tightly controlled. Those facts create a realistic frame in which a human error could become fatal without becoming public. In a storage yard, trains can be parked and left. In a restricted space, doors can be locked and left. In a layered property arrangement, responsibility can be assumed and left. If someone is inside a sealed rail car in such a space, their disappearance is not guaranteed to be noticed quickly, and their location is not guaranteed to be easy to reach. The city above continues, loud and indifferent, because it has no sensory access to what is happening under its feet. That is what sealed alive ultimately means here. Not a dramatic execution, but an infrastructural possibility, a place designed to be forgotten, functioning exactly as designed. In the end, Track 61 does not remain frightening because of any single proven tragedy. It remains frightening because it demonstrates a quiet truth about large urban systems. They contain spaces where human presence is not expected and therefore not protected. The city depends on those spaces. It also depends on not thinking about them. And on certain nights, when the terminal above ground empties and the sound of trains becomes less a roar than a vibration felt through stone, the thought persists with mechanical clarity. Beneath the Waldorf Astoria, beneath the sidewalk gratings, beneath the unmarked doors, there is a platform wide enough for a reception and narrow enough for abandonment. There is a track meant to hold what should not be seen, and there are ways to close it that do not require anyone to notice what is inside.